Hello everyone, welcome to MediaNama. In January this year, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology released a draft of the Digital Personal Data Protection Rules, DPDP rules, which are a step forward in operationalizing the DPDP Act, which the government had notified in 2023. One of the aspects of the rules that has become a hot topic for debate is obtaining verifiable parental consent before processing the data of anyone under the age of 18. The rules state that companies must take appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure that they don't process the data of anyone under the age of 18 without parental consent. Also, when obtaining parental consent, platforms have to verify the age and identity of the parent as well. They can do this either by relying on information that the parent gives voluntarily, relying on information that they have about the parent in case the parent already uses their platform, or relying on a virtual token mapped to the age and identity of the parent. Given the limited information about how platforms will verify parents, many are theorizing different ways verifiable parental consent will come into operation. One such theory is using Know Your Customer or KYC based verification processes, which are already in place for industries like finance in India. To discuss the use of KYC as a means of age verification, we have with us Amlan Mohanty, a tech policy advisor and a non resident research fellow with Carnegie India, who has recently written a working paper about this topic. Hi Amlan. Just to start off, I understand that you worked on a working paper about the privacy concerns associated with age verification under the DPDP rules. And I understand that, you believe that the method that companies will invariably end up relying on is KYC. So just wanted to sort of get your perspective on, KYC emerging as the sole sort of mechanism for age verification.
Thanks, Kamya, for that question, and thank you for inviting me. I should start by saying that this is actually a topic that I've been tracking for many years now. I remember it was Jan of 2018 when I was in this open house discussion with Justice Sri Krishna when the committee was preparing the draft bill, and this issue of parental consent came up. And we were all in that room thinking, something here sounds off, right? Obviously, there's the high threshold of age 18, but it felt like, we were going down this path where there would be some collateral damage or unintended consequences. And when the act was passed and these rules were being framed, I wanted to dig deeper into that issue of what could those unintended consequences be. And I was able to then narrow down that issue, according to me, was, you're going to have to collect more data to be able to verify parental consent. And one of the ways I thought seemed most practical would be KYC. And that was my thesis. And I feel like, having written this paper, I do feel like that's definitely the path that will go down. So, just before I get into your specific question, just to take a step back and kind of what my working paper essentially says, in 4 key points, is that number one is that there is this really high threshold, right, for verifying parental consent in the DPDP Act and rules. There are 3 different parameters that you need to verify: age, the identity of the parent, and the parent-child relationship, right? And we can get into this, but that's a high threshold. 2 is that, the way in which the Act and the rules have been designed seems to me to suggest that KYC is going to be a very popular method of kind of complying with this requirement. And there are, 3 specific reasons that I suggest that this will happen. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that this is going to be the only method that companies adopt, right? So it's not going to be the sole method. It's not going to be the only method, but it's going to be one of the methods that's going to seem most likely. And I give 3 reasons in my paper for why that is, right? Number one is because there's such a high threshold, there aren't a lot of other mechanisms by which you can actually help verify age, ID, and parent-child relationship. And you can argue that even with KYC, perhaps it's not going to be effective. But that is why I feel like, other than other methods that people have discussed, soft verification methods like, facial recognition or so on are not going to cut it. Companies are going to, if they want to comply, going to try and maximize compliance through a KYC-based method. 2 is the familiarity of Indian organizations with KYC, right? A lot of companies already, follow and adopt KYC. It's something that a lot of consumers are familiar with. So I think, the familiarity in the Indian ecosystem with KYC is the second reason that KYC will be a very popular approach. And the third, I think, really important reason is that the draft rules themselves allow for repurposing of data that companies already have to verify parental consent, right? This is in the draft rules. And so if a company already has KYC data, they're going to be able to better comply with this requirement. So that creates an incentive for companies that don't have this data to use KYC-based methods, or for companies that already have KYC, for companies that don't have KYC data to start thinking about perhaps having a KYC-based approach to both have this data, let's say at registration for onboarding or so on, but also to be able to meet parental consent requirements down the line, right? So really the crux of my argument is that there's a high threshold. KYC is going to be very popular. And that's going to result in a massive, privacy and cybersecurity risk, specifically the inability for users to be anonymous or pseudonymous on platforms that adopt these measures. And so I get into a set of recommendations on that.
Right. One of the things that, I want to ask you a question about from what you just said is, the verifying parent and child identities. I'm just wondering whether that's really like a strict requirement under the rules. I understand that that is one of the implications. We've talked about that as well, but very specifically, the rules have not asked sort of platforms to do that. So, would it even be a fair assumption that they would have to take that step?
Yeah, no, it's a good question and an important one. And I'll answer this in two parts, right? A literal reading of the act and the rules says that you have to do that, right? If you just look at the Parent Act, right, Section 9, it says that you need to verify the consent of the parent of such child, right? Those are the words. And so it says parent of such child. So it's very clear that you have to verify the relationship between the parent and the child, right? Two is if you look at the explanatory note that the government issued along with the draft rules, it also says that you need to verify that this is the child's parent, right? So there seems to be overall a recognition that this is important. But having spoken to a lot of people who are thinking about compliance, I feel like there has been a kind of consensus built within the industry and across different stakeholders that this is not something that we really need to kind of put front and center as a compliance requirement. And that's fine. Sometimes people have creative, convenient interpretations. But I just want to kind of move to the second part, which is like a very practical implication of this, right? For me, the kind of example I often give is, there's a minor, 16-year-old child who wants to get onto a platform and asks his 19-year-old friend, right, to verify on consent on their behalf. So this 19-year-old friend provides, their Aadhaar details, they can use a token, whatever it is. But what the company is then verifying is that this is someone above the age of 18, which this 19-year-old friend is. And they have verified the identity of this person, right? That this is a 19-year-old person who's claiming to be 19-year-old. What it doesn't verify is that this 19-year-old person is not the parent of this child, right? So this child then gets access to this platform. And really the question I'd ask is this a risk that platforms are willing to take? Because down the line, this is a child whose data is being kind of collected by a Chinese, company that's being processed, that's probably resulted in some kind of a financial or some other kind of psychological harm. And that's going to be a high risk, high profile incident down the line. At that point, regulators, courts might ask companies to demonstrate compliance with the act and the rules. And that's where I think there's going to be some a scenario in which companies might have to introspect a little bit and say, perhaps it makes sense to also focus a little bit on the parent-child relationship.
Got it. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently in the context of the rules and consent is the fact that the government also recently announced that private companies can use Aadhaar authentication for verification purposes in the interest of the state, is what they say. And I was just thinking, could Aadhaar be used for age verification purposes? And if this is implemented, then going back to the question of how do you sort of figure out parent-child relationships there?
Yeah, it's definitely an important development, a very recent development. As I was finalizing my paper, this came out. I think there are, two specific use cases that the new amendments to these rules, I think, are relevant from a parental consent framework. One is that it enables authentication, Aadhaar-based authentication to enable access to services. So you can just see a very clear relationship between what the amendment is trying to do and what verifiable parental consent is about accessing digital services through authentication mechanisms. And it also talks about the importance of promoting innovation and access to knowledge. So I think there's a way to look at how these amendments in some ways facilitate or enable the use of Aadhaar-based authentication for verifiable parental consent. So I think there's a very close relationship between what the amendment does and what might happen in respect to Aadhaar-based authentication. Now, is this going to be effective? Look, there are issues with Aadhaar itself, right? As even UIDAI recognizes. Is this proof of citizenship? No. Is this proof of date of birth? There's been a lot of back and forth. The UIDAI issued a circular which says, yeah, we're not wholeheartedly, categorically saying that this can be proof of date of birth. It depends on what kind of documentation was submitted to establish and provide this at the time of Aadhaar enrollment. Ultimately, it's the authenticating agency which is going to have to decide whether it's something they are willing to recognize as date of birth. So even on this question of, age identification, is Aadhaar foolproof? No, right? Beyond that, you're going to have issues around, authentication, error rates, very high kind of error rates when it comes to Aadhaar-based authentication. So these are all issues that exist, right, with respect to Aadhaar. But that, let's be really pragmatic about it. What's the alternative? There aren't a lot of other IDs that actually provide, like I said, proof of age, of ID, of relationship. If you look at the passport, right, passport has details about, parents' details, right? So that could be one. The APAR ID is one which has details about both the child and parent. So there are, ways in which you can potentially establish parental relationships. But if you just take a step back at a practical level, what my argument is that there isn't going to be a one ID on one technology solution that's going to cover this. It's probably going to have to be a combination of different things, right? You use birth certificate for date of birth, you use Aadhaar for identity, and you use a APAR ID or a passport for parent-child relationship, right? What I'm really trying to get at is the rules need to enable this, right? A combination of technology solutions to be able to enable this. But really, the point I want to get to is that this has to be done in a data minimizing, privacy preserving way. How can we get to that is really the question that I'm trying to answer in my working paper.
Yeah, so, and you've heard this as well, that APAR IDs sort of are one of the solutions that people are thinking about. And, these IDs can sort of like be pinged without the platform sort of knowing specifics about the person, just like they'll be able to verify if you fit in this threshold sort of thing, without knowing whether you are, let's say, 25 or 45, whatever the age may be. So are those solutions really privacy preserving? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're getting to a good point, right? Which is this larger question of tokens, right? And the principle there is that really there are two entities on either side, or three entities in some cases, where essentially all of the entities it's data blind. You don't really know what that data is. So if you're asking about date of birth, you don't actually ping the server to know what is that person's date of birth. You just get a yes or no binary response on whether they're above the age of 18 or not. Great, right? On principle, this seems to be privacy preserving, but I'll argue kind of two things, right? One is that, even the logs of these pings could have some potential privacy implications, right? I've done a lot of thinking around, the privacy implications of metadata. So just at scale, right? Just transactional data, right? Who you're pinging, what kind of service you're pinging, what are the types of services, what's the frequency of this use, what time does this happen, right? At a massive scale, at a population scale, this could be potentially sensitive, right? So think about, centralized server, which is, storing the data about all of the pings around parental consent, right? Over a period of time. And if these are obviously, as the rule suggests, linked to personal identifiers around age and ID, this is a massive database that is potentially sensitive from a national security point of view, right? You don't want, let's say, an adverse nation to have access to this kind of information at scale. So I think there are privacy implications about just even pinging, servers to get binary information, right? But I would say that's a much lower risk. The more important, I think, fact is to make APAR IDs a practical solution for parental consent. They need to have sufficient coverage. That means, every child or parent needs to be part of the system, right, to be able to ensure that it's a scalable, reliable system. And by all accounts, this is meant to be a voluntary system, right? And I know there's a lot of coverage. MediaNama has done some coverage about how parents are being pushed to adopt IDs. And so I think this speaks to a larger, I think, social issue about coercion and trust, and about building a reliable system, right, based on some level of coercion. And is that the path that we want to go down or not? I think is the question that I'll leave you with.
Understood. Going back to KYC just a little bit, one of the things that I heard in discussions that I've attended around age verification is that, KYC-based age verification will be easier for platforms that allow people to log in through mobile numbers, because telecom companies already go through a KYC-based process to verify the identity of anybody who's obtaining the phone number. But from stuff that MediaNama has covered in the past, people we have spoken to in the cybersecurity domain, um, fraudsters tend to forge IDs to sort of do the eKYC process that a lot of telecom companies require and basically bypass being caught by the process itself. So, in that context, how effective can we really say KYC would be in verifying identity, in doing any of the things that we're emphasizing it to do?
Sure, Kamya. I mean, this is a very slippery slope because what you're saying is that even KYC won't be a sufficiently reliable mechanism. Whereas my argument is really, KYC is overkill. So let's use more, privacy preserving technologies. But let me answer your question, right? Yeah, IDs can be forged and therefore KYC is not a reliable system. We've seen many examples of this. But let's be practical about this, right? We do need to verify if we are going down the path of parental consent and, needing to verify parental consent for, XYZ reasons, we need to have some kind of verification system. And, KYC seems to address a lot of these issues. The point you made about, telecom companies, for example, having access to this data actually leads me to another thought, which is that the French regulator, data protection regulator recently has been experimenting with this idea that, again, in a tokenized, privacy preserving data blind way, the use of, banks or telecom companies as the resource that you would use to verify documentation. They already have, these details around age and ID. So rather than companies kind of collecting these details additionally, you just ping the servers of the bank of the telecom companies or an intermediary that is integrated with the bank and telecom companies tools. I think that's a much better path, right? Because what does it do? It ensures that every company is not having to collect this data again, right? Because that's a data maximalist approach that this privacy law should not be encouraging, right? So banks and telecom companies have to do this anyway. Yeah, and in my paper, I get through the history of KYC. KYC was first developed to be able to investigate financial crimes, to be able to link, financial transactions that are fraudulent or, subject to, some kind of illegal conduct to specific individuals, right? That was the original promise or vision of KYC. It has been slowly expanded to things like, direct benefit transfers, welfare schemes, onboarding users, and so on. So let's stick to that original kind of purpose and say, financial companies should continue to do that. Banks should continue to do that. Maybe telecom companies should do that. But why should every new digital service provider have to collect all of this KYC details again, right? And that's not the path we should go down. So I see a privacy preserving situation where, companies that already have KYC data should be the ones who continue to store and host this in a privacy preserving way. But every other company that's operating online just pings the servers, let's say directly or through an intermediary, to again provide some form of verification of age, ID, and relationship.
Got it. Just one more thing I was hoping to get your inputs on because your working paper also elaborates on that. What are some alternatives to KIC that companies could use to get verifiable parental consent while sort of, ensuring the tenets of the act, the privacy preserving nature of the law that was supposed to be, is still maintained?
So yeah, the paper gets into this. I have a table where I list out a few different alternatives, but really I'll preface this by saying there's no one perfect solution, right? And I think one of the interesting solutions that, in the course of my research that I found was this idea of social vouching, right? Which is, again, a platform, reaches out to a group of people that enables, the platform to say, there are a group of people who are able to attest to the fact that there is a parent-child relationship existing between the user and the person who's consenting, right? It's essentially a way of reaching out to a group or community to say, hey, can someone verify that this relationship exists, or that this person is above 18, or that this person is claiming who they are to be, right? Now, of course, there are lots of drawbacks around that. People used to kind of get gazetted officers to notify, like it's a character certificate or relationship certificate, and those can be forged too. How do you reach out to these people? How do you know that they're actually vouching for the right thing? So of course there are defects, but I think this is a very interesting way because you're not collecting, documentation about, millions of people at scale. You're using a social vouching system, right? The other example could be, just a photo upload, right? And a photo upload could be not of a government ID, but just of your face. And that again, is in some ways collection of additional data, but that could, again, through age estimation technologies, establish that if someone has a beard, or looks a certain way, it probably means they're above the age of 18, right? Or you could, for example, establish the ID of a person, right, based on a kind of a facial recognition software, right? There are also ways in which parents can, if they already have an existing account on a platform, delegate, certain ability for the child to access certain services, right? And there are companies, global companies that have implemented this, right? Again, doesn't rely on the collection of additional identification data from both the children and the child and the parent. So I think, again, going back to my original point, there isn't going to be one solution that does this, right? And what I would really urge, policymakers as they're finalizing these rules to do is think about how a combination of different technology-neutral, privacy-preserving solutions can help achieve these regulatory outcomes.
Thanks, Amlan. This was great. Getting your comments on this was really helpful.
Thanks, Kamya. It was great to be here, and thank you for the wonderful questions. I hope to continue being engaged on this issue.
Thanks for joining us. If you want to learn more about the DPDP rules and about age verification, you can take a look at our website.